What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2003 BMW E46 M3. On the M3 behind me today, we're going to be covering front hub replacements. On the M3 and E46s, the front hubs and the wheel bearings are one piece. We're going to be replacing both sides with some OE FAG units. We'll also be replacing the dust shields, both inner and outer, as well as our stub axle nut. Typically, you want to do these every 80 to 100,000 miles. However, in some cases, they can last longer. The vehicle behind us is at about 170 on its original unit, so there's a good example of how long they can last. As they age, they get a little bit noisy. In some extreme cases, you can jack up the car, give the wheel a little bit of a tilt from north and south, and if you have a little bit of a wobble, then more than likely your bearings have gone bad. Now, before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. And now for tools. For this job, we're going to need a couple basic tools and one or two specialty tools. Always needed a torque wrench. We have a 1/2-inch drive and a 3/8 drive. We also have two different size ratchets, a 1/2-inch drive and a 3/8 drive, as well as a 1/4-inch drive just for the 5mm hex for your ABS sensor and your set screws. We have a small extension. We have an S-hook or caliper hook. You can also use a bungee cord in place. We have a 46mm nut for our stub axle nuts. We have a 32mm socket for our bearing installer tool, as well as a 14mm socket for the end. We have a 17 for our wheel lug bolts. We have a 19 and a 14, again, just for the specific specialty tools that we're using. Your 3-jaw puller or 2-jaw puller may require a different socket size. We have two different hammers, a rubber mallet, as well as our main big boy hammer. We also have a flathead screwdriver, a small pry bar that'll be handy for removing our inner dust shield, and a small 1/2-inch chisel, as well as a brass pin for seating in our shield. Some nice to haves, as always, are an impact gun as well as an electric ratchet, just to make the removal and install of hardware a little bit quicker. I recommend ceramic paste behind your rotors as well as around your brake components, not the brake pads, of course, and a small paint pen if you want to mark down your bolts after torquing them down. Now that we have a gist of what we're going to be using for our tools, let's get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, today we're going to work on the passenger side of the M3. However, the driver and passenger are going to be completely identical, so just rinse and repeat. To get started, we're going to remove our wheel by removing our 17mm nuts. Well, nuts in this case, this vehicle is equipped with studs, but we are going to convert it back to lug bolts. So 17mm socket, impact gun, let's zap them off. All right, my good people, now that we have our wheel off, the first thing we're going to do is start removing our brake hardware. But before we do that, I like to break the dust cap off first. That way the rotor creates a little bit of drag on the hub assembly, so it's not just dancing around on me. So I'm going to grab my chisel and my hammer and just work on creating a lip around the seal so that we can pry it off. At this point, we should be able to pry it out. Just get rid of that. Now we can work on disassembling the rest of our brake hardware. A 5mm hex to remove your set screws. With our set screws off, we can work on removing our anti-rattle clip. I'm going to use my flathead screwdriver to remove my dust caps from the rear as well. Sometimes these like to get stuck over time. With those off, we're going to use a 7mm hex on a socket bit to get the guide pins off. Now we're going to get our caliper hook ready. You can also use a bungee cord like I mentioned earlier. Now we can grab our caliper hook and hang our caliper off to the side. Make sure we catch these pads as well. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our two 16mm bolts that hold our carrier bracket in place. Now we can go ahead and remove our rotor. Set this to the side. At this point, our next step is going to be to unstake the stub axle nut. Depending on if it's been replaced or not, the walls may be thin enough for you to just go ahead and pry them off with a screwdriver. So you can see only one side is indented over here or staked in. I was able to get most of it off with that. But just to make our lives easier, we'll go ahead and hit the last bit out with our chisel. Now we're going to take our 46mm socket and our impact gun and zap that off. You can use a large breaker bar as well. However, the gun will make a quick process of this. Excellent. With that off, our next step is going to be to pull this hub assembly off. In some cases, you might be able to literally just pull them off if they're pretty worn. For us, we're going to need a puller. You can use, again, a 3-jaw puller or a 2-jaw puller. The one I have specifically is a 2-jaw. It's a bit small in the sense that my end here just feeds into the stub axle. So what I'm going to do as a spacer is use a small extension to fill the gap. So I have my extension in here, again, just acting as a spacer. Depending on the tool, you may or may not need to do that. Get that situated as best as possible. My tool specifically takes a 16mm socket or wrench. I have a socket on the impact. It shouldn't take a lot of force to drive this out, so we'll give this a quick try. Hang on to the hub. We're going to use this as a tool to drive in our dust seal during install, so just keep this to the side for now. All right, at this point, we still have our inner race still stuck in here, as well as our old dust shield, so let's work on removing those. To do that, I like to remove the brake shield first. We have 3 10mm bolts that hold that into place. We're going to zap those off, and then we'll give you a better view at what's back here. Using a 10mm on a long extension. Now we should be able to get the shield off. Just be mindful that your ABS sensor is here. You don't want to damage that when you pull this out. If you want to remove it, you need a 5mm hex bit to pull that out. We're going to set this to the side for now. Now we have a better view of our inner race as well as our dust shield. Now at this point, this is going to be depending on what tools you have. That's going to decide the way you're going to pull this race out. We have a small 2-jaw puller that we're going to use, but I just have to make myself a little bit of room to get that tool started. I'm going to take my chisel and hammer and just smash in 2 of the sides of the dust shield just to give myself a little bit of an opening so I can get my hooks in, and then we'll pull that inner race out. Now I'm going to take my small puller. Again, there's different tools out there that you can use. These are the ones that I actually had on my set, so this will work nicely. I'm going to put my spacer back in, and then this tool specifically uses a 19mm socket. Beautiful. Now, using a small flathead screwdriver or a pry bar, you can work this old dust shield off. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And there it is. Get rid of this. And now we can work on cleaning up our area. First, I'm going to wipe off any residual grease that's on here. Clean off my ABS sensor while I have the room, or wheel speed sensor. Now we're going to take a Scotch-Brite pad and just clean up the area where our dust shield sits. If this is corroded in any way, which hopefully it shouldn't be, try some light steel wool or a Scotch-Brite pad. Now we're going to go ahead and grab our old bearing that we pulled off, as well as our new dust shield, and we'll show you how you're going to use that bearing to drive in your new dust shield. All right, we're going to take our new dust shield and we're just going to set it into place as best as we can and as evenly as we can. So now here we have our old bearing. The inner race is gone. That one was stuck to the stub axle shaft. And then I just used a socket and a hammer, and I popped out the inner race as well. So now what this is going to do is this is going to glide over our axle stub without getting stuck on there again. And the back metal portion, or around the ABS ring of our bearing, is going to be the driver for our new dust shield. You never want to drive these in with your new bearing. You're going to damage the back seal. In this case, this is garbage. We're not too worried about it. So we're going to take this and our 46mm socket, and we're going to use them as a tool to install our new seal. So mount that up as evenly as you can. Situate your socket in there. And then with your hammer, get that started. That is almost perfect. I have a hair length of seal sticking out on the left-hand side. I'm going to use a brass punch and a hammer just to even that out. We can go ahead and reinstall our dust shield. I went ahead and cleaned ours off camera real quick. It just snowed here the other day, so there was a lot of salt on the roads. With this all cleaned up, kind of have to work it around the seal. Now you could argue that you can put this on before you put the seal on. However, I like to be able to see all around as well as Just get a good eagle view of everything so I know that it's not going in crooked. Now, if you're wondering why our dust shield has a large chunk missing from it, this car once lived with a big brake kit, so they did that for the cooling aspect. Otherwise, you should have more of a sealed surface there. Now with that situated, we can grab our new wheel bearing and hub assembly and start sliding that on. So let me grab that. Now that we have our new hub, we're going to go ahead and slide it over. Try to do this as evenly as possible. Now we're going to grab our hub tool, get that situated as best as we can. 13mm socket or wrench on the end here. And we're going to thread the internal piece onto our axle stub first. Once it bottoms out, let that be. You don't need to over tighten it. Now with that situated, I'm going to take my 32mm socket and my 1/2" drive ratchet and just suck in this hub until it's fully seated against our dust shield. All right, nice and snug. Now we'll take our 13 and remove the inner portion of our tool. The specialty tool actually takes a 14mm socket or wrench on the end. 14mm, I'm sorry, it's not a 13. I'll have to revise that. Beautiful. At this point, our hub assembly is fully pressed in. All that's left to do to secure this is install our new lock nut. To do that, you want to take your new nut and you want to use specifically a little bit of engine oil to lubricate the back surface as it seals up against the bearing end. That way it doesn't bind up and you get a proper torque value. So I'm going to take a little bit of engine oil, liquid moly specifically, give it a light dab, and then we'll get that situated. Now we have our lock nut lightly coated with engine oil. We're going to go ahead and install it by hand first. Then we'll go ahead and tighten it down with our 1/2" drive ratchet and our 46mm socket. Once you have it snug up as best as you can, take your torque wrench and torque it down to 214 foot-pounds. Beautiful. And with that, we're going to go ahead and stake it into our stub shaft. Again, using the same chisel and hammer method. And then if you want to, as insurance, you can paint mark it. However, this should never move on you considering you staked it into place. But worst case scenario, you never know. At this point, we can go ahead and secure our dust cap. And for the dust cap, we recommend you use a light coating of RTV sealant around the edge just to keep moisture and debris out of the bearing side. So a little bit of RTV, let's get that prepped. Light dabbing of RTV around the edge. Now we can go ahead and get that situated in place. And you can take your die blow hammer, rubber mallet, whatever you have lying around, and snug that dust cap into place. Cool. Make sure you wipe off any excess RTV. Beautiful, baby. At this point, the last thing I want to do before I get ready to install my rotor is give this a light coating of anti-seize or ceramic paste. I prefer the liquid moly ceramic paste. So we're going to go ahead and give that a light coating so that way our rotor hopefully does not seize itself to the hub. So next time JR takes his brakes off, he has an easy time doing so. All right, at this point we're ready to reinstall our brake. So let me grab my rotor and we'll get started with that. All right, let's take our rotor, get that situated back in place. Make sure you line up your dowel holes correctly. And then you're going to take your set screws and your 5mm hex and get your 2 set screws situated. The manual calls for 12 foot-pounds. I think that's a little bit excessive on the set screws. I personally like to just snug these up gently by hand, but 12 foot-pounds is the required torque spec for them. All right, good old calibrated wrist. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. And then we're going to put a fresh dab of ceramic paste over them just to lock out any potential moisture. Again, this is more insurance if you're in the Northeast like we are. We're in the Rust Belt. Beautiful. Now we're going to go ahead and get our caliper carrier back in place. Get our 2 16mm bolts and get those started by hand. I'm going to be a little extra and put a little ceramic paste on the non-threaded portion of the bolts just to keep them from seizing up. We just worked on this car 4 days ago, and after a trip to The mountain and back, they were pretty seized in there, so that should hopefully help us for the next time we work on this car, which will be very soon. 16mm socket, we're gonna go ahead and snug those up, and we're gonna torque them down to 81 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna go ahead and sit our brake pads back into our carrier and our caliper, so let's go ahead and do that. I like to use a light amount of this ceramic paste on the end of the ears where it rides on the caliper bracket. It also helps kind of keep them in place from dancing around on you. Don't forget to pull your hook out. Situate your caliper back in place. And then I like to take my anti-rattle clip and situate that next. That way it holds everything in place and I can take my time, grab my guide pins and get those started. Sweet. Get your 7mm hex bit ready and your guide pins ready to go. I like to use a little bit of ceramic paste on these as well. There's always a hot debate on whether or not you should grease these up before install. I've had really good luck doing it the last 10 years, but I'll let you make that choice. We'll go ahead and get these guide pins started. I'm just going to zap them in the rest of the way with the electric ratchet, and then we'll torque them down to 22 foot-pounds. Don't forget to put your dust covers back on. Now we're going to go ahead and put our wheel back on. We're going to use some fresh lug bolts, get our 17mm socket, and then we're going to lower the car down and torque it to 90 foot-pounds. All right, now let's put it back on the ground. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward job on the front hubs for the E46 M3. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.